The silence of the night was so complete that even Henry's own breathing seemed a disturbance. Suddenly, a crackling sound. At first he thought it was just his tired imagination, but the sound was repeated, this time more muffled, as if someone were rustling something heavy on the floor. Henry tensed. His heart beat faster. He listened. Yes, there was movement approaching. Fear, cold and prickly, pierced him. He opened the bathroom door cautiously, leaving it a barely ajar slit. In the half-light of the bedroom nightlight, he saw a silhouette thick, dark, incomprehensible. The silhouette stood between their beds, above Rudy. Henry couldn't make out his assailant's face, but he saw his hand moving with furious swiftness, holding something that glimmered in the dim nightlight. One terrible question arose in Henry's mind. Who is it? And what is he doing with Rudy? Martin and Teresa, and their children Rudy, Henry and Marley. The head of the family was a successful businessman who had achieved everything by his own efforts, becoming a millionaire by the age of 54. Martin was the managing director of several companies, including a German real estate company. But deep down, the man was a family man who did a lot to provide for his wife and children. Teresa Van Breda was one of those mothers who would protect her children from anything and everything. She was kind and compassionate and had a very optimistic outlook on life. Martin and Teresa had 2 sons and a daughter. The oldest son, Rudy, was 22 years old and a guy who was very passionate about learning. After earning a bachelor's degree in college, Rudy decided to continue his education and enrolled in university. The middle son, Henry, from his boyhood, stood out in obedience by his education and was quiet in character. He attended college in Australia for several years, having his brother's example before him, and then went on to study physics. It could be said of Henry that he gave the impression of a calm, poised and collected young man of 20 who could be charming, especially with girls. And Henry already had a girl named Danielle. The youngest of the Van Breda children was Marley, who turned 16 and was a ray of light for the family. Pretty, cheerful girl, spent her time with friends and family, was interested in everything a girl of her age could do. A close bond between parents and children, a cozy home in which the Van Breda family could spend their time, and enough money to spend on whatever they wanted. At first, the Van Breda family lived in Iowans. They later moved to Australia to be closer to where their children were studying. But eventually Teresa and Martin wanted to move back, especially since it was easy to do so with Martin's job. After discussing the possibility at family council, the Van Bredas decided to move. They sold their home in Australia and in 2014 found a beautiful cozy home in Stellenbosch, which is located outside of Cape Town. In fact, the new residence was a luxury home located in the middle of a gated golf estate. At the time, the crime rate in Iowans was elevated, and in the neighborhood where the house was purchased, it was dangerous to go out when it got dark, if there was any desire to go out at all. However, the estate that the family bought had fences with wiring and gates, a staff of top-notch security guards and CCTV cameras at almost every turn. So it seemed that inside, behind the fence and gates, nothing could threaten their lives, especially since the neighborhood was beautiful and romantic, with amazing nature, a golf course, a winery, a restaurant, and everything necessary for a normal life, a well-off family. Rudy, Henry, and Marley gradually settled into their new place, made new friends, renewed old acquaintances. The family lived happily in the new place under one roof, and everything was fine until one incident changed their lives forever. Unfortunately, Henry was the only person who could remember the chronology of the events of that night. According to Henry's explanation written to the police, on the evening of January 27, 2015, after eating dinner together, the family went to their respective corners of the house. Marley was in her room. She was reading a book, and Rudy decided to go for a jog around the neighborhood. Henry and Martin watched a movie and had a few glasses of wine. All in all, the family spent a peaceful Monday evening, and as night approached, Martin and Teresa's parents retired to their bedroom, and Marley, whose room was next to her parents', also turned off the lights fairly early and went to bed. Rudy and Henry shared a twin bedroom on the second floor, the same place where his sister's parents' rooms were. Rudy worked on an assignment on his laptop and eventually drifted off to sleep. Henry sat at the opposite end of the room watching a show on his computer. The time was approaching 4 o'clock in the morning and Henry was starting to get tired and wanted to sleep. So he returned the laptop to the desk and turned on the outlet before leaving the room to use the bathroom. It was then that Henry heard something break the silence, that there was some kind of noise. At first he assumed that he had just heard something from fatigue, but then the unexplained sounds and noise repeated itself, and Henry opened the bathroom door ajar to look out into the bedroom. In the semi-darkness of the nightlight, Henry saw someone's silhouette standing between his and Rudy's beds, and this silhouette of a man was attacking Rudy with an object that Henry couldn't see in the darkness. Henry kind of froze in fear and tried to figure out what was going on. Then he screamed for help and the lights in their bedroom suddenly turned on. Henry was finally able to see the horrifying reality of the scene. A man was chopping Rudy with an axe. He was dressed in dark clothing, gloves on his hands and a balaclava-type mask on his face. The light was turned on by Martin, who came running in and was so horrified he tried to stop the attack. He got between his son and his attacker, but the next blow from the axe hit him. Henry later said he heard the masked stranger laughing as he chopped down his father. Martin's body went limp on the bed, and Henry did not see him move again. All this time Henry stood motionless, having lost the ability to think and move from shock and fear. Suddenly his mother's voice rang out. "What's going on?" That's when the attacker turned his attention to Teresa. Just a few moments later, Henry heard his mother being attacked with the same axe. He could not see the attack from the threshold of the bathroom, in the doorway of which he stood in shock, and only picked up the sounds. Suddenly the man notices Henry standing in the doorway of the bathroom door, and begins to move toward him. Henry tried to close the bathroom door, screamed in fear, and realized that he had to do something, somehow save his life, and with a swift movement he rushed into the room towards his attacker. Henry managed to wrestle the axe from the criminal's hands, noting that he managed to do so with surprising ease. While the struggle for the axe was going on, Henry heard his brother on the bed making gurgling noises. After wrestling the axe away and pushing his attacker away, Henry was attacked again. The large intruder lunged at Henry with a knife, and managed to inflict multiple wounds to his chest, stomach, and forearm. They struggled, and at one point the knife fell to the floor. That's when the stranger abruptly broke free and ran out of the house. Henry said he heard other voices coming from outside at this time, but could not make out what was being said. So he threw an axe at the fleeing outlaw, but missed. The axe smashed into the wall, and Henry ran after the outlaw. However, weakened from the fight, he slipped on the stairs and had a rather painful landing. By the time he regained consciousness, got up and ran outside, there was no one there. Henry found his phone in his shorts and wanted to call the emergency services, but his head was a total fog and he couldn't remember and dial the number. Then he tried to call his girlfriend in a panic, but the time was 4:42 a.m. and she wouldn't pick up. Henry was forced to look up the emergency number on the internet. Then he made the call, and the last thing he remembered was seeing Marley lying next to their mother Teresa on the floor. Next thing you know, Henry had already passed out and blacked out for a while. In fact, he was unconscious for about 2 hours, and when he woke up, he found himself lying at the foot of the stairs. Henry tried calling several emergency numbers again, as he probably didn't know where to call because he had been away from home for 8 years, and again his attempts were unsuccessful for some reason. Henry then picked up the landline phone in the kitchen and started dialing, but he didn't want the panic in his voice, and to calm himself down he lit a cigarette, waiting for an answer. When it was possible to contact the emergency dispatcher, the conversation lasted more than 20 minutes. The dispatcher was worried, did not understand everything at once, for some reason could not find the given address, asked a lot of unnecessary questions. Of course, everything looked very incomprehensible, with family members bleeding in the house and long conversations on the phone. In addition, it's worth noting that Henry spoke to the dispatcher in a very calm, indifferent tone, as if he were ordering takeout. Henry later attributed this tone to the fact that he was taught to speak slowly and calmly as a child due to his stuttering. Since the dispatcher could not get an address, Henry gave the address of the nearest neighbor to their house and went outside to meet them. When the police arrived, they found Henry sitting outside with his arms around his head, covered in blood spatter, wearing only shorts and white socks. Once police arrived at the Van Breda family residence, Martin, Teresa and their son were pronounced dead as a result of their injuries. Marley was unconscious and at first thought to be dead. But the girl was still breathing, had a severe head injury, and was rushed to the hospital. What's interesting, Marley was found lying next to Teresa face down. But the girl's wound was on the front of her face as if she had been attacked, and then she got up and tried to run away. Then they tried to finish her off. Most likely she was trying to escape unless her body was moved. The ambulance worker said he had never seen such a horrific scene in all his years of working. When the bodies were being dragged, literally all the stairs were covered in blood. On February 5, 2015, the funeral for Martin, Teresa, and Rudy was held. Marley was unable to attend because she was still in the hospital in critical condition. So only Henry saw the family off on their final journey. For the months following the family's murder, Marley and Henry stayed away from each other as the police were still unsure of what had happened that night. Marley underwent several surgeries and further treatment that actually saved her life. Although Marley recovered, she was diagnosed with retrograde amnesia, and the girl could not remember anything about the events of the horrific night. It's a condition where the brain sort of erases the events that traumatize the memory and doesn't remember what happened at any particular time. Thus, Henry became the only person who could tell what happened that night at the Van Breda family home. Police speculated that the crime may have been committed by a local gang that was known for burglarizing homes. However, this crime was completely atypical for them. Nothing had been taken in this house. There was a wallet and a laptop in plain sight in a room downstairs, and these items were not missing, so gang involvement was ruled out. Mr. Cornelius Van Breda, Martin's brother, described his brother's family as friendly and decent with no enemies. Henry also admitted that he did not know anyone who held a grudge against their family. So the puzzled police officers searched the house once again, and this time they noticed that there were no signs of forced entry on either the windows or the doors. In fact, only one pair of stained footprints were found in the house, and they belonged to Henry. Also strange was the fact that the perpetrator had not brought any weapons with him. The axe and knife that Henry claimed were used against him were taken from the house. Both of these items were located on the first floor. And another startling observation: Henry suffered only superficial minor wounds at a time when almost his entire family was brutally murdered. Upon closer analysis, it was learned that Henry's socks were stained not only with his own blood, but also with the blood of every member of his family, although it is possible he may have been able to walk up to his relatives and check on their condition. The police also noted that when they arrived at the house, Martin, Teresa, and Rudy had been dead for almost 3 hours. Why didn't Henry call the police? And the fact that he called his girlfriend first and spent so much time looking up emergency phone numbers is very suspicious. Another very, very strange thing is that the emergency numbers in this family were posted on the refrigerators. And when asked about this, Henry said that he saw a list of numbers but didn't think they were the ones to call in an emergency. When the axe that Henry allegedly threw after the perpetrator, which stuck into the wall, was examined, it was clear that the axe had been thrown into the wall at close range and with a controlled hand, that is, simply stuck into the wall when the person was standing next to it. The blood expert indicated that Rudy's body had been moved several times. The question is, why would Henry do that? Further, when questioned, Henry changed the details of his story time and time again. When answering questions in court, he mumbled a lot and didn't like to repeat his answers. At this point, all the evidence was pointing to Henry, and he understood that. In September 2016, Henry turned himself in to the police, but when he arrived in court, he did not plead guilty. The trial ended up lasting 67 days. At the end of the trial, Henry Van Breda was found guilty of 3 counts of murder, 1 count of attempted murder, and 1 count of obstruction of justice, and received 3 life sentences, plus an additional 15 years, making his total sentence 95 years. In a video taken in the courtroom during the sentencing, Henry looked calm, if not indifferent, showing no emotion of remorse, regret, or even anger at disagreeing with the verdict. He is cold-blooded and looks like the kind of man who would call the emergency services and explain with icy calmness what had happened and how to find his home. Serial killers and maniacs, statistically speaking, also often show no emotion, and the nod Henry made upon hearing the verdict looked like he was accepting his sentence because he did. Police have never been able to determine the man's motive for killing 3 members of his family and nearly taking the life of his younger sister. One speculation is that Henry's monthly allowance for expenses from his family was cut, and since Henry was taking illegal drugs and the constant costs of those drugs were increasing, he decided to commit the crime. There is also a theory that Henry was always jealous of Rudy, who outshone him with his abilities in learning and achievement. After killing his brother, he had to kill the others to cover his tracks. We'll probably never get a real answer as to why he did it. Henry went to serve his sentence in a jail cell, and his sister Marley will have to live the rest of her life without her family and with the realization that people can't be trusted, even if they are your family members. If you have opinions on the motives behind this horrific crime, write in the comments. Thanks for watching. I recommend checking out other true crime stories as well. Click right now and also subscribe to my channel. See you soon.